Well, welcome back, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to day 3 of our focus week. And as you know, we're going to be talking today about fraud and risk. And I hope you enjoyed the session that we had earlier on this morning. And right now, I'm really pleased to be joined by AP legend Mary Schaeffer, AP legend and author, I should say,
Yeah.
Mary Schaeffer. And we're going to be talking about, is your P2P at risk from fraud? And I think I can think of no better person to talk to about this topic than Mary Schaeffer. But before we go any further, Mary, perhaps for anybody who doesn't know you, you just want to perhaps give yourself a little bit of an introduction, if you would,
Sure.
please.
So thanks, Ellen, first of all, for inviting me. As you know, I love the AP audience and the community, the P2P community also. I'm Mary Schaeffer from AP Now, and I've been writing about anything that you can think about, accounts payable, for over 20 years. I think it's close to 25 years now, and I'm just happy to be here. We have some books. We have a free e-zine, and of course, we have a YouTube channel with a lot of short AP videos.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would
And
recommend
Ellen is
that.
on some of them.
I am indeed. I would recommend it to anybody who hasn't come across any of those yet. Definitely go across to Mary's LinkedIn page, and I'm sure you've got a lot of the links and connections on there. So
Absolutely.
a whole wealth of information, and in fact, some of that shared on our P2P network
Yes. Yes.
LinkedIn group page
Yes.
as well, so you can connect with a lot
Yes.
of that on there as well. So, Mary, this morning we're going to be talking about your P2P fraud,
Mhm.
and whether you're more at risk now than ever before. And I think that, I don't know about you, but we seem to hear a lot more about
We
it
hear about
um,
definitely.
than we had before. But do you think that there is actually more of it about?
So there's two sides to that. I mean, the truth of the matter is we'll never know because you only can report on the frauds that you uncover. You can't report on the frauds that go undiscovered. I think there's probably not that much more than there used to be, but there is a wider spectrum. We have all these electronic payment frauds, which if we were talking 10 years ago,
Mm,
about fraud, which was still a huge issue, we wouldn't be talking about these change of bank accounts, these phishing emails, and all this other stuff. I think also we're probably better at ferreting it out today.
mm,
And also, the last thing, which I think is a good thing, is people are more willing to talk about it. If you went back 10 years ago, or even I remember when I first started covering accounts payable, people never wanted to admit in public that they had been defrauded. It
mm.
was an embarrassment to the company. It was a sign that the internal controls maybe weren't up to snuff. And we've kind of gotten away from that. So, like I said, we don't really know what the true numbers were. We really don't know what the true numbers were from 20 years ago because
Mm.
people wouldn't talk about it. They kind of hide it under the covers, if you will.
Absolutely, and I think that perhaps it's a little bit more visible now,
Yes.
as well. Perhaps the technology, but we'll come on to that a little bit later, has helped. But I think you're right. I mean, it would be nice to think, wouldn't it, that some of the fraudulent activities that go on or fail to go on, or perhaps get talked about more, is as a result of perhaps what's being put out there, some of the information that you're doing, some of
Right.
and your connections, and what we talk about on PPN and
Right.
other areas as well. You
Right.
would like to think that people are looking at those and thinking, actually,
Hopefully.
these are the
Hopefully.
hopefully these are the things that we should be looking out
Right.
for,
Right. And
and perhaps we can change those. But it's interesting what you're saying about talking about it too. Do you think that the profile of a typical fraudster has changed, or maybe is there such a thing as a typical
no.
fraudster?
So I think that no. So the answer to that question is no. And I think if we start thinking that there's a typical profile, and when we talk about a typical profile, people immediately start thinking about electronic payment fraud,
Mm,
phishing frauds, and they think about this nefarious character who's in a third world country who's hacking into their email systems and their payment systems. And that is definitely one type of fraudster.
mm,
Don't let me give you the idea that I think it's not. but there are other fraudsters that we are all at risk for. We may not have been at risk from these guys 10 years ago, but
Mm,
there were domestic fraudsters, and there continue to be. I'd be lying if I told you, oh, all the fraud comes from, other countries. It doesn't. A lot of it is domestic,
mm.
especially like in the US when we talk about check fraud, which I know you don't have the same issue with it, and we'll just leave it at that. Um, but we both, US, UK, and virtually every country has people who, make their living by defrauding others. There's one other area where companies are at risk, and nobody likes to talk about this, and nobody likes to think it could happen to them, but
Mm.
that is, you are at risk from your internal employees. Your employees know where your weaknesses are, and most of them are very honorable and won't take advantage of it. But I don't want to say everybody, but almost every company at some point or another will have an internal thief. And
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it's sad to have to think like that, isn't it? But
yes,
I think that certainly what we tend to report on PPN, it seems to involve people that we perhaps know and trust. And
yes.
why do you think that is? Because it seems like it's a sort of like a converse way of thinking.
So there's the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. You notice the way that just flows off my tongue, and they probably have done the first fraud study, and they do it every 2 years.
Mm,
And they at first it was just the U.S., to be honest, but now they do it for the world, and they do it for all different countries. And they talk about occupational fraud or internal fraud. And one of the features that has remained the same from the first survey to now is that internal fraud, occupational fraud, when it's committed, is committed by long-term trusted employees,
mm,
most frequently. Not to say a new employee can't defraud you, but
mm,
and part of that is, I get to know you, I get to trust you, I let my guard down, and then we have an internal control weakness, and maybe we have an inappropriate separation of duties because I know you and I trust you, and I think,
mm,
oh, Joe would never steal from us, or
mm.
Jane would never steal from us, and voila,
They
guess
do,
what?
because
Yeah.
they've got that. I suppose they've got an opportunity. It
Yes.
always interests me as whether they've decided to do that, whether they've done that intentionally, or whether it's somebody who has been working within the company for a while and notices that weakness and just goes ahead and does it
They notice that
on the spur of the moment. You know.
they notice that weakness, they rationalize it. Oh, they don't pay me enough. Oh,
Mm,
so and so gets paid too much. Whatever the story is, they rationalize it. And then also sometimes there's a situation in their personal, their own circumstances. A
mm,
lot of times it's drugs, gambling, and unfortunately, sometimes medical debt. Sometimes what you'll see is there was a family member who was sick, which you probably don't have
not really. No.
because your
Mm,
medical system, let's just say, operates differently than ours, rather than
mm,
get into a big
mhm.
discussion about that. But in the US, it sometimes is medical debt, and it's really heartbreaking.
I'm sure it is, and I suppose it's those kind of things that we need to look out for. If somebody perhaps is behaving in a certain different way, and look at the employee behavior and see
Right,
whether that's changing, and then perhaps confront that, and perhaps that's where we can go back to what we were saying just now about perhaps society as a whole is becoming more open and more
right,
able to talk about
right.
things.
Because we see about
And
it in other areas also.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And so, in something like that, perhaps you're talking about it could actually stem from something which could be a mental health issue.
right,
So
right,
if you've got those kind of policies in place, then perhaps you'll be able to talk about it before it becomes an issue.
right,
Obviously, there are others that go about things because they want to, and they
right,
want to defraud the company, and certainly we talk about at PPN people who are um, defrauding their company to fund a more lavish lifestyle than they
right,
could otherwise afford.
right,
We've
right.
all sorts of stories come to light. So, do you think there can anything really be done about it?
So, yes. So, we talked about employees who take advantage. They take advantage because they know where the weaknesses are in your system. So
Mm,
the simple answer to that is, and I say it's simple, but it's not really, is have no weaknesses. So that means have strong internal controls. I know this is boring, but it works. Have strong internal controls across the board, no exceptions, not for Joe or Jane, who's so
mm,
wonderful and, only has the company's best interest at heart. Have appropriate separation of duties, and then do what you're supposed to do, and you will severely limit. I'm not going to say completely eliminate,
mm.
because there's always somebody who maneuvers around, but you'll minimize your risk for internal fraud.
No,
So yeah, there
absolutely.
are things you can do.
And I have to say, we don't find it boring because it's like
No, we don't.
it's knitting those policies together and making sure that your company is as watertight as it can be.
Right.
It has a broader, a more wider ranging
Mhm.
impact than you might think.
Right.
Um, so what part in all of this can technology play? Because you've talked about perhaps putting the right processes in place
Mhm.
and looking out and having conversations with the people within your
Right.
team who you are perhaps worried about their behavior. And that's a human element of
Right.
it. But obviously, increasingly, companies have got technology in place. What can that do to help confront or prevent
So
fraud?
technology is a double-edged sword.
Mm,
We've been talking about all these electronic payment frauds, okay? And there's nothing
yes.
we can do about them. They're out there. They are enhanced by technology. Technology facilitates them. They're
Mm,
there. There's nothing you can do about it. But on the flip side of it, you can use technology on your own side. It helps you sometimes identify a potential fraud faster, as
mm,
you, especially if you use one of the many products that are on the market now. A lot of them are now using AI, so that they
yes.
can identify potential. And I keep saying potential because then you have to get a human in there to investigate, because sometimes something looks like it's fraudulent, but you know what? It's not. But
Mm,
the important thing is investigation, and investigate on a timely manner. And then, just as you use automation to make your processes more efficient, part of that is going to be integrating your strong internal controls, doing it in a way that there are no exceptions. So technology can help on many fronts.
yeah. And it's interesting what you say, that it's not necessarily picking up just fraud, but it can be error as well. And I think
Right,
that, part of the day that we're talking about today, it includes that as well, because we're talking about risk, risk doesn't necessarily mean fraud. It means,
right, Mon-
inefficiency,
right,
and loss, in terms of monetary loss,
right,
and within your team as well. So it can actually mean something like duplicate payments, for
right.
example, can't it?
Right. One of the
Um,
things that I like to say about whether you're talking about fraud or duplicate payments is whatever control you put in place, you get double bang for your buck,
mm,
as we
mhm.
like to say over here, because the control will help hopefully stop a fraud or prevent a fraud, but it will also prevent you from making a duplicate payment. So they
Yeah.
kind of go together, if you
Yeah,
will.
exactly. So I mean, we've talked about duplicate payments, but are there particular areas that within the P2P processing, that you think are more susceptible to fraud than others? I mean, and the reason why I'm asking that is because, people listening today might be thinking, actually, do you know what? I'm not sure about my processing. I might want to go back and look at it in closer detail. Is there somewhere where you think they should start looking?
So you should look across your whole processes, and even like put yourself in the shoes of a crook and say, how could I defraud the company if I wanted
Yeah,
to? And if you can figure out a way to do it, you can be certain that others can also. What I would
yeah,
like to say is it's the whole process from the beginning to the end. One of the things that we've seen
mm,
over the last few years is crooks have come up with ways to defraud companies that I got to tell you, I would never have thought of.
yeah,
And if they can figure it out, you can figure it out too. And we have this whole thing over here, and I think you have it also. All these phony, please change my bank account emails,
yes, yeah,
where we have a new best practice that whenever you get one of those emails, you have to pick up the phone and call the company to verify it, which takes additional time, and it's not exactly the most progressive when we're talking about using technology, but you have to do it because you send the money to the wrong bank account and you're out the money.
It
Um,
it certainly does happen over here, and it's sometimes what we call Friday frauds as well, because
yes,
it
yes.
tends to happen right at the end of the week. People are wanting to go home.
Uh,
It's the weekend.
and
Perhaps aren't thinking.
God forbid, Friday is also the end of the month, a particular
Mhm,
Friday.
mhm,
Now
mhm.
you're at a double risk.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I had something just in my own personal life that was before Easter, and the thing that actually flagged it in my mind, because we, before the start of a 4-day weekend, and something from my own banking, I thought, something about this doesn't feel right. And I looked into it, and sure enough, it was a scam. And I thought, goodness, this actually even happens. Well, I know it happens in your personal life, but
Right,
it brings it all home.
right.
And
And
but talking on a business to business scale, much wider, and with disastrous effects sometimes.
right, but at least you realized it. And one of the things that we see with some of these frauds and some of these emails is they are so realistic looking.
Yes.
We used to joke in the beginning about the bad English. It was a
Mm,
dead giveaway that it was a phony email.
mm,
That's all gone.
yeah.
These things look legitimate. Sometimes they even have the company logo on it, the letterhead. It's scary.
In fact, this for me was completely. It seemed like it was completely legitimate, and the only reason it flagged in my mind, it was slightly unusual, but that, it seemed like it was legitimate. But the only reason why it flagged in my mind was because it was just before the start of a long weekend, and knowing what we know,
So
and thank goodness it did. But that is a thing for companies to look out for, isn't it?
mhm.
Um, what would you say to people and organizations who may be listening to this today and thinking, well, that's all well and good, but you know what? It's not going to happen in my organization. My organization is not at risk from P2P fraud. I hear what they're saying, but that's for other
Other
people. We're
people.
fine.
Right, it doesn't happen here. So my first reaction, when I hear people saying that, I wanna go, "No, no, 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 don't,
Mm,
please." But okay, it's like saying, "I never make a mistake,"
yeah.
from my lips to or your lips to God's ears that you're not at risk. Everybody is at risk. These guys are so smart, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they'll find ways that you never thought of, and if you are, one of the first people to get hit with this fraud, and I wish I could tell you what the next one was because
Mm.
I don't really know. Um, don't think that you're giving yourself a false sense of security, and then when $1 million goes or £1 million goes flying out the door, um, yeah, don't complain, but please don't think that. It's better to put all these controls in place and have them prevent the fraud. Don't think that it can happen to anybody.
And that's right, isn't it? You need to be looking out for these, and have those controls in place, because then you're almost protecting yourself, aren't you? Well,
Right,
you are
right.
protecting yourself, but you're protecting perhaps your nature, which may be inclined to trust the Joe or
Mhm.
John, who is
Right.
there in your organization, who you want to trust. And sometimes these are just there to protect the organization, and also to protect us as well.
Mhm.
So
Exactly. And
what what
there's another thing, Ellen, that I wanna bring
yeah.
up. When we talk about fraud, or we talk about the loss to the company and, all that type
Mm,
of thing, there's another, loss, if you will. The employee who unwittingly falls for that fraud is often devastated. So there's
mm,
that personal cost, if you will,
yeah.
to our employees, and I don't think we focus on that enough.
No, you're right, actually, because in a lot of the news items that we talk about where fraud has happened, there's a little snip at the end, and it says what has happened, and sometimes it's the organization has fallen by the wayside, but a lot of the times, because it has been someone that has conducted this, that's been there at the company for 6 years, 10 years, perhaps longer, and a lot of the fraudulent activity has been going on for three
Right.
plus years sometimes.
Yeah.
It has a really serious knock-on effect on the people who are involved in that.
Right.
Discover that fraud, or maybe they were the ones who didn't discover it, as you're
Right.
saying,
Right.
and I think that it can have quite serious long-term effects,
Yeah.
and I think, yes, perhaps more focus should be
Yeah.
made on those people as well. So that, and again, that just goes to show another reason why we need to protect our
Mhm.
organizations and make sure those policies and perhaps the technology is there in place.
Mhm.
Um, and I know you've asked me this question on your AP Now podcast, Mary, but I'm going to reverse it back onto you. Whether what's the most bizarre kind of, or perhaps unusual fraud that you have perhaps come across in
So,
your time?
I have one that it wasn't me personally.
Mm,
So, I was telling my husband one night at dinner about one of my first bosses. I don't know how I got talking about it. I didn't know how at the time I worked for this man, and he was brilliant. He was really brilliant, and he was charming, and he went up the corporate ladder very quickly, and he got different jobs at different companies really quickly. And after dinner I thought, oh, I wonder what happened to David. So I got, because I'd lost touch, so I get online and I do a quick search, and I eventually find him. He's got kind of a common name, so it
mm.
wasn't that easy to track him down, but my sleuthing skills were there and I found him. And where was David? David was in a federal penitentiary
Oh,
serving 12 and a half years for
oh no,
embezzlement.
gosh.
And according to the newspaper reports, clearly he wasn't willing to talk to me about this. He had embezzled
You
4 million.
didn't invite him onto your podcast.
No, no. I mean,
Not yet.
what's the matter with people? But anyway, he had embezzled 4 or $4.5 million from and he was
Mm,
president of the organization at the time that
wow.
that happened, and he was prosecuted, which doesn't always happen over here for white collar crime, and he was sentenced, 12 and a half years. And I
Wow.
only discovered all this like reading online. And 12 and a half years in the United States, you might think, well, he went to a white collar prison, so it was a walk in the park. But
Mm.
apparently if your sentence is more than 8.5 years, you don't go to a white collar prison, you go to regular prison. So at the age of 61, he went
Oh,
to prison
wow.
for 12 and a half years, and he served
Blimey.
the whole sentence.
Gosh.
And he,
Wow.
nice, charming, brilliant, Harvard, University of Chicago,
Mhm.
well educated, not who you think would be.
But isn't it funny? It's like, well, it's not, obviously it's not funny, but it's
No,
the that's the kind of person who you
long-term
think you could
trusted
trust.
employee, right?
And I suppose, and as is the case in a lot of the companies that we talk to, that person has in some way been in charge of setting up the system and the policies which are mapped into the risk analysis. So they are in charge of that process. So at whatever point it stops with that person, that's where the fraudulent activity takes place, at whatever level that is. And sometimes it's with, as you know, sometimes it's collusion, isn't it? Sometimes it's collusion with a supplier, but sometimes it's just that person siphoning off money into several accounts of their own, isn't it?
Right.
And you trust that person, especially if they've been there for a long time and they look and sound the part.
Yep.
So, I mean, bearing all that in mind, where do you think is a good place to start for companies looking at their risk prevention schemes?
So I hate to say this, but and I go back to your own personal story when you said,
Mm,
"Oh, it's Friday."
mm,
Be suspicious. Be
right.
suspicious of everything. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Encourage your staff to point out anything that looks odd. Even
Mm,
if you investigate and it turns out it's fine, just be suspicious. And then again, put yourself in the shoes of a crook and say, if I was trying to defraud the company, how could I do it? And you might even, especially if you get a new hire,
mm,
ask them to do the same thing, because it's somebody looking at things through a different set of eyes. Maybe you'll look at things a little bit differently. But
mm.
one of the things we've seen with all the different new frauds that have come up is they are across the board. It's not only, hey, we only have to educate the accounts payable manager or the accounts payable director. A payable director.
Yep.
Some of the newer frauds, like this gift card fraud, they're going after low-level employees. So you're at risk over the whole spectrum of your activities.
And I suppose that goes for procurement as well, doesn't it? The
Yes,
procurement team,
yes,
because
because there's
with
a
their
ton of opportunity there, if you will.
working with suppliers as well,
Yes.
and sometimes what you can see is you've got a procurement leader working with their supplier, and also there's somebody within finance as well. So you've got
Right.
a three-pronged approach to fraudulent activity, and it's interesting because I know that some people listening to this will be thinking, "Gosh, that's how unusual! That certainly
No.
couldn't happen with."
No.
I mean, you and I know that it happens all
Mhm.
the time, and probably, or almost certainly, more than we know about, because
Well,
the
with procurement, you have also that gray line that you maybe not don't have an accounts payable. I
mm,
take you out to lunch. Then I take you out to a really nice lunch. Then I take you to a play at the West End. Then I take your family away for a weekend. At what point have you crossed the line?
and it's again, it's where we need to have our processes and policies backing us up, isn't it? Because you need to have those relationships.
Right.
Whether I sometimes think that procurement can be like, and sometimes obviously even yeah, when working in finance and accounts payable too, there's an element within all of that that aligns to what would be naturally assumed to be a sales position,
Right.
because we're all working for a company towards the same objective,
Right.
the same
Right.
strategy. Um, so you need to have a relationship with people, certainly with your suppliers and within the rest of the team. But you're right, there is a point where that relationship can sometimes become blurred, and
Yes.
then you can find yourself in not such clear waters. It can become a bit murky.
So can I tell you a little story that happened to me
Sure.
personally?
Hmm.
So at one point in my career, in my illustrious career, I was doing the derivatives trading for the company that I worked for,
Mm,
and I always went with the best price. I was pretty black and white about it. And there was one bank who was never getting that; they never quoted the best price, so they didn't get the activity.
mm,
Pretty black and white as far as I was concerned. And Christmas time came, and the guy at the bank sent me a case of wine, of expensive wine. Now,
mm.
if you want to bribe me, expensive wine is not the way to go. Okay, so just for starters,
I'll remember that. And then no
yeah,
wine for
right, right.
Mary.
Wine won't do it. So I was furious. I was so mad. I went into my boss and I said to him, "I'm just here to tell you, I got a case of wine from whoever it was, and I'm returning it." He said, "Why are you returning it?" He was horrified. And I said, "Because if he thinks this is going to impact any trades that I do, he is 100% wrong." And he said to me, "No, Mary, it's not going to impact anything you do. Believe me, we all know that, but you keep that case of wine." So I said, "Well, I'm not comfortable." So I gave everybody on staff a bottle. All got to come in and take the bottle of wine. And that guy, he called me up and he said, "So, did you get the case of wine I sent you?" I said, "Yeah." I said, and I gave my boss the bottle, and I gave my staff, everyone on staff, the bottle. And what I wanted to say is, and it's not going to impact our relationship, but I didn't say
You
that.
left that
And
one out. That was
yeah,
implied.
right. Oh, I was furious.
All right. So, I mean, I think we've been talking about processes, policies, people, technology, and how that can help prevent fraud
Mhm.
and highlight the risks that you might have in the processing. But that's just one element of it, isn't it? I think
Mhm.
sometimes if you've got all of those things in place, it can actually lead to other areas of the business, and you can find all kinds of other efficiencies. Once you may be looking at it from a fraud prevention
Right.
perspective, but do you see it going further than that?
Yeah, if you're doing a really good job, you're either preventing the fraud because you find it before it goes out the door, or you're deterring it. And to go back to your example of companies who say, "Oh, we don't have to worry about that because we don't have fraud."
Mm,
Hopefully, the reason they don't have fraud and they think they don't have fraud is not because they haven't found it, which is
mm,
always a possibility, but because they've done such a good job at prevention and deterrence. And when you do that, you're protecting against duplicate payments, which is a real benefit for your company. And you tend to have a more efficient operation, another
mm,
benefit, if you will.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, if you were anybody listening today and thinking, "Do you know what? Are there a few things that I should be looking at, or I can get out of this What are they? Have you talked about where you can start, and you talked about going all the way through from the top to the bottom? Um, but are there perhaps like 5 key pointers that people should be perhaps looking out for? We talked about one, people perhaps coming into the office maybe early
Yeah.
and leaving really late. Perhaps that can be an indicator of somebody that may not be doing all the things they ought to do. Are there any others which might be just like flags that you need
So
to look out for?
So number one, early and late is
Mm,
again maybe a loyal employee, but maybe not. Along the same lines, an employee who never takes vacation should be something to look at. It's
mm,
not good from an HR standpoint, but as a best practice, everyone who's involved with your money, which includes everybody in accounts payable, people in treasury, and some other people, should be required to take 5 consecutive days off. And in those 5 days, somebody else should do their job. They shouldn't take the 5 days off and then do the job remotely, okay? Because
mhm.
that um, eliminates the benefits. Somebody else should do it. And the theory is if there's an ongoing fraud, that in those 5 days it will become uncovered. 2 other things that I like to recommend. Okay, oh, one other thing: job rotation, which nobody
Yes.
does. I
Mhm,
talk about it all the time, and then, like if I'm in a live setting or a webinar, I say how many people are doing this, and 2 people raise their hand.
mhm, mhm,
But really rotate, especially if you have a large accounts payable processing staff. If you have more than 2 processes, if you have 5 or 10 processes, rotate them from account to account. People will say, well, it's good that they get to know their counterparty on the other part, at the vendors, because this way, if we have a problem, they can call up and get it resolved. And that's true.
mm.
But as a deterrent or as a prevention technique, really, you don't want them to become too good friends, because then they send a case of wine and they give them a better price. And then 2 other things. One I've already said, but really train people to be suspicious and to question everything. You should be able to have your lowest level processor question a transaction that was put through by a senior vice president. Now, maybe they don't go directly to that person, but
Mhm,
they go to their boss, and the boss goes to the controller, and the controller goes to that person. But nobody should be immune from having their transactions questioned, because that's how, I don't know, $4 million gets stolen,
yeah.
by the president of the company. I don't know how he did it, but I'm guessing that had one. And then the last one, and I call this the silver bullet because everybody can do this. This costs nothing. Is educate everyone about fraud, and when there's a new fraud, educate everybody. And when I say everyone, I like to say from the CEO down to the guy who sweeps the floor or the woman who sweeps the floor. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much, because sometimes just knowing about the fraud, like Ellen said earlier, when in the fraud in her personal account, she knew it was Friday before Easter holiday, I think you said, and
Mm,
that was suspicious. So that set her mind at ease
yeah, yeah.
going. We have this gift card scam going on in the United States now. Just knowing it's going on, gift card scams. Oh, I got an email from the CEO asking me to buy gift cards. Just by knowing the fraud is going on, you'll recognize it as a fraud and you won't pay for it. So educate everyone as soon as you hear about a new fraud, and everyone immediately. Don't wait for the month end staff meeting, because that might be 2 weeks away, and
Mhm.
heaven only knows what can happen. And good luck to everyone. And
Fantastic.
what the audience can do is, when they hear about a new fraud, if they tell me or even tell you, you'll publicize it,
Well,
and
yeah,
we're all in this
exactly.
together.
I think so, and again, I think it sort of touches on what we said earlier as well about being much more open as a
Right.
society and within our organisations. I think we talk about these things, and they're much more open, like you're saying. Then you're gonna spread that news more. And I think that's a great tip that you can share at the end there. Just educate your staff more and educate yourself as well,
Right.
because there's a lot you can find out, even if you're just going on to LinkedIn. And it's interesting what you were saying there about from top to bottom, making sure everybody's involved, from your CFO perhaps down to, down along to the cleaning staff as well.
Right.
We had a fraud that we talked about a while ago now that was actually identified by a member of the cleaning staff.
Really?
She picked something up because there was all sorts of activity of literally going into the bin, and she
Hmm.
kept on putting them away, and to the point where she then raised that to somebody, and it turned out to be, actually, do you know what? After further investigation, it
Right.
came to light that was actually a fraudulent attempt. So the more you talk about this with absolutely everybody, I mean, that's an extreme example, but the more
Right.
you talk about this with
No, but
everybody, the more likely it is that something's going to happen. If you create that open culture within your
right.
company, then people aren't going to be afraid to do that either.
Right. And she obviously felt comfortable enough to
Mm.
bring this to someone's attention and say, I think something's not right here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, before we go then, Mary, do you have any other, oh, you've shared quite a few already, any other top tips, or maybe just one final top tip
So, I mean,
to
I
share
hate
with the readers?
to say this,
Listeners?
be suspicious. You know that old saying, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission when you're trying to get something done. It's better to say to somebody, oh, I'm sorry I delayed your payment,
Mm.
than to send money to the wrong person and then have it gone. So, yeah,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's very true to say, and a great tip to everybody too, because that ties into trust ultimately, doesn't
right.
it? And we are trusting people, but perhaps in this circumstance,
No,
we can't be.
no, we can't be. I mean, I hate to say that, be suspicious, but you
Well,
know,
no, do you know what, it once you've got all the controls there, so you can have that as part of it, but you've got the controls in place within
right.
your processing to protect and underpin everything that you're doing.
Yep.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mary, for sharing all of your insights today with us. And as I said at the beginning of the conversation, you can find out some more tips and tricks and information from Mary Schaeffer's AP Now podcast and page, and also on our PPN LinkedIn group as well. And you guys, if anyone's listening today and aren't members of those two communities or groups, then obviously come along and join
Please
us on
join.
there. Yeah.
And thank you for having me, Ellen, and thank you for hosting this week. I think it's a wonderful service to the P2P community.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for sharing again, and I shall speak to you soon.
Soon. Hope to see
Take
you
care.
soon.
All
Take
right. Bye
care.
now. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye bye.